The ghost in the ship. The space station floated in the dark, silent and abandoned. No lights, no signals, no signs of life. Only the endless void of space surrounded it, like a graveyard in the sky. Inside, Captain Eric Monroe walked carefully through the empty halls. His boots echoed against the metal floor. The air smelled stale, untouched for years. He checked his scanner. Oxygen levels were stable, but something felt wrong. Eric was sent to investigate the station, the last known location of a missing research team. No distress signals, no records of what happened, just silence. But he was not alone. Something moved, a soft whisper, like the wind, though there was no wind in space. A door creaked open behind him. Eric turned quickly, his hand resting on his sidearm. Nothing, just an empty hallway. His eyes narrowed. He wasn't imagining things. Someone, or something, was here. The presence in the dark. Zyra watched the human from the shadows. He was different. He noticed things. For years, she had wandered the station, unseen, unheard. She thought she was a ghost. Her people, the Silurists, had long mastered the art of invisibility. Their cloaking technology was perfect, so perfect that when the accident happened, she had become stuck like this. No one saw her. No one heard her. They thought she was dead. At first, she had screamed, cried, begged for help. But no one ever answered. The others left. The station was abandoned. She had been alone ever since. But now, a human had arrived. And he could sense her. Impossible. The human knows. Eric kept moving, but his instincts were on high alert. He was a veteran, a survivor. He had seen things in the deep void of space, things that didn't make sense. He could feel eyes on him. A presence, not hostile, but watching, studying. He reached the command center, brushing dust off the old control panel. The screens were cracked, but one flickered to life. He tapped a few buttons, checking logs. Last entry. Experiment failure. Distortion field unstable. No survivors. Eric frowned. No survivors. Then who or what was moving around the station? A faint sound. Something sliding behind him. He turned fast. "I know you're there," he said, his voice steady. The silence was heavy. Zyra froze. No one had spoken to her in years. No one had ever noticed her. How? A game of signs. For the first time in a long time, Zyra felt curious. This human was different. He was not afraid. She decided to test him. Slowly, she moved a wrench across the floor, letting it scrape against the metal. Eric watched calmly as the tool slid by itself. Instead of running, he smiled. "Clever," he said, "but you'll have to try harder than that." Zyra's heart raced. He knew. He was talking to her. She reached for another object, this time a data pad, and lifted it into the air. Eric raised an eyebrow. "Nice trick, but I've seen better." He reached into his pack and pulled out a small thermal scanner. Zyra tensed. Eric pressed a button, and the screen showed a faint heat signature, distorted, like a shimmer in the air. "There you are," he whispered. Zyra gasped. Not a ghost. Panic surged in Zyra's chest. He could see her. No, not fully, but he knew she was real. For years, she had believed she was a ghost, a lost soul, trapped in an empty station. But this human, this stubborn, clever human, had found her. Eric crouched down and placed the scanner on the floor. Slowly, carefully, he took out a small notepad. He wrote 3 simple words. "I can help." Then he slid the notepad toward her. Zyra stared at the words. Her hands trembled. Was it possible? Could she really still be alive? For the first time in years, hope flickered inside her. But could she trust him? The invisible one, lost in the dark. Zyra didn't move. She barely even breathed. For years, she had wandered the station, believing she was nothing but a ghost. No one had ever spoken to her. No one had ever acknowledged her presence. Until now. The human, Captain Eric, knew she was there. She stared at the notepad he had pushed toward her. The words were simple but dangerous. I can help. Help. How could he help her? He didn't understand what she was. He didn't know the pain of being forgotten, abandoned. Zira clenched her fists. Maybe this was a trick. Maybe he was testing her, waiting for her to make a mistake. Maybe she really was just a ghost. But then, how could he sense her? For years, she had lived in silence, unable to speak to anyone, unable to make them see her. She had tried everything. She had written messages in the dust, screamed into the security cameras, banged on doors. But no one had ever answered. And yet this human smiled at the moving wrench instead of running away. This wasn't normal. This wasn't supposed to happen. A dangerous decision. Zira had two choices. Stay silent. Hide. Watch from the shadows. Take the risk. For years, she had chosen the first option. But today, her hands trembled as she reached for the notepad. Her fingers hovered over the paper. She couldn't write. If she touched the pen, it would float, and she wasn't ready for that. Instead, she made her choice another way. With slow, careful movements, Zira pushed the notepad back toward Eric. Eric didn't flinch. He only smiled. I'll take that as a yes, he said, his voice calm. Zira's heart pounded. Who are you? Eric leaned back against the control panel. He was taking a risk, but he trusted his gut. Something was here. Someone. Not a ghost, not a monster. Something alive. His instincts had never failed him before. He had felt it the moment he stepped onto the station. The way the air shifted. The way the silence felt too unnatural. And now he had proof. He tapped the scanner on his wrist. The device had picked up a faint heat signature, but it was erratic, unstable, like it was trapped between two states. Eric exhaled slowly. You're not a ghost, he said, his voice steady. You're real. Zira's breathing hitched. No one had ever said that before. The truth in the air. The truth was, Zira didn't remember how she ended up like this. She had been part of a research team studying cloaking technology. Her species, the Silaris, were natural experts in stealth. They had developed a way to bend light, erase sound, even disrupt energy signals. But something went wrong. One day, there was an explosion in the lab. The station shook. The alarms blared. And then, nothing. When she woke up, she was like this. Invisible. Silent. Forgotten. Her team had searched for survivors. They had walked right past her. She had screamed, waved her arms, banged on walls. But no one saw her. No one heard her. After a few weeks, they left. They assumed she was dead. And maybe she was. For years, she wandered the station, unable to contact anyone. She tried to fix the equipment, but it wouldn't register her presence. She tried to send a distress signal, but the system wouldn't respond. She had spent so long thinking she was alone. But now, a human stood before her, a human who could sense her. How? The human's trick. Eric studied the scanner again. The distortion was weak, but it was there. He had seen similar things before, stealth suits, experimental cloaking tech. But this was different. This was natural. It wasn't a device. It was her. Your people, Eric said, thinking aloud. They abandoned this station, didn't they? Zira tensed. Eric noticed the faint flicker of heat on his scanner shift, like someone had stiffened in surprise. I'm guessing they thought there were no survivors. The silence stretched. I don't know if you can talk, Eric continued, but if you can, I want to help. You're not dead. And I don't think you're stuck forever. Zira's pulse raced. Was that true? Could she really be saved? For years, she had believed she was lost, that she would wander this place forever. But now, a human had found her. A silent answer. Zyra took a deep breath and made her decision. Slowly, carefully, she picked up the notepad and turned it over. Then, using a single finger, she dragged it through the dust on the floor, writing just one word. Yes. Eric grinned. That's what I like to hear. He reached into his bag, pulled out a second scanner, this one more advanced. I'm going to figure out how to see you, he said. And then, I'm going to bring you back. Zyra's eyes burned with emotion. For the first time in years, she wasn't alone. She wasn't a ghost. She was alive. And maybe, just maybe, this human could save her. The human trick. The first contact. Zyra had spent years lost in the silence of the station, wandering like a shadow, a forgotten presence in a dead place. Until now. Until him. Eric Monroe was different. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't confused. He understood that she was there. And now he was trying to bring her back. He had said something that shook her to her core. You're not a ghost. You're just invisible. She had spent so long believing she had faded from existence, that her body had slipped into some void between life and death. But what if that wasn't true? What if she was still here, just unseen? The idea sent a shiver down her spine. She had written one word in the dust, a single, uncertain answer. Yes. Yes, she was real. Yes, she wanted to be saved. But how? The human's plan. Eric sat cross-legged on the cold floor, staring at the scanner in his hand. His mind worked fast, calculating, problem-solving. He wasn't a scientist, but he had dealt with stealth technology before. Cloaking suits, light-bending fields, even sound-dampening tech. But Zyra, she was different. She wasn't using a machine. This wasn't some fancy alien gadget. This was biological. He ran a diagnostic scan, watching the data scroll across the screen. A faint heat signature, slight air distortions, electromagnetic fluctuations. That meant one thing. She was still part of this reality. She hadn't faded into another dimension or become a ghostly apparition. Eric grinned. I can work with this. The test. Zyra stood silently, watching the human with curiosity. She had spent years in isolation, thinking she was lost forever. But Eric was different. He had a plan. And humans, she had heard stories about them. They were problem solvers. They never gave up. Eric pulled out a small thermal pad from his toolkit. He tapped the screen, adjusting its settings. This should work, he muttered to himself. Just need to adjust for the refractive index. Zyra tilted her head, unsure what he was doing. Then he did something that shocked her. He reached out, toward her. She flinched instinctively, stepping back. Eric chuckled. Yeah, that's what I thought. He had guessed where she was, using the faint shifts in temperature. Her chest tightened. How was he so aware? The hunter's instinct. I was a soldier once, Eric said, as if reading her thoughts. He kept his tone casual, almost friendly. You learn how to sense things. Stealth suits, ambushes, snipers hiding in the dark. He tapped his temple. You can't always see your enemy, but you can still feel them. Zyra stared at him, her mind racing. This human had trained himself to notice invisible things. He wasn't relying on machines. He was using his instincts. That made him dangerous. And fascinating. All right, Eric said, pulling out a small container of fine powder. He opened the lid and tossed it into the air. Zyra gasped. The dust floated around her, clinging to something unseen. Her. For the first time in years, she saw her own outline. She wasn't just a shadow anymore. She was real. The fear of being seen. Zyra took a step back, panic rising in her chest. She had been invisible for so long that the idea of being seen again was terrifying. What if she looked wrong? What if she had changed in some way she didn't understand? Her hands trembled. Eric noticed. He stayed calm, giving her space. It's all right, he said. Baby steps. Zira swallowed hard. She wasn't sure if she could do this, but she had to try. She had spent too long in the dark. The message. Eric set his scanner aside. "You've been here a long time, haven't you?" he asked. Zira hesitated. Then, slowly, she picked up the notepad again. Her fingers shook as she wrote. "Years." Eric exhaled, his expression unreadable. "You thought you were dead," he said quietly. A long pause. Then, another word appeared on the notepad. "Yes." Eric's jaw tightened. He felt the weight of that single word. Isolation. Fear. Desperation. He had been stranded before. He had known what it was like to be left behind. But not like this. Not trapped in a body no one could see. He clenched his fists. No one deserved that. Especially not someone still alive. The promise. Eric met the empty space where he knew Zira was standing. "We're going to fix this," he said, voice firm. "You are not alone anymore." Zira didn't move. For so long, she had believed she was lost, that her existence no longer mattered. But this human, this strange, determined human, refused to let her disappear. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust again. So, for the first time in years, she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, weak, but it was real. "Help me." Eric's lips curled into a grin. "Now we're talking." The lost truth. Memories of a broken past. Zira sat in the silence of the control room, staring at the dust-covered console. She hadn't touched it in years. She had thought she would never touch anything again. For so long, she had believed she was nothing more than a whisper, a flicker in the dark, a forgotten soul in an abandoned station. But now, the human had changed everything. Eric Monroe. A man who had sensed her presence when no one else could. A man who had thrown dust into the air just to prove she was real. A man who had promised to help. Zira wasn't sure if she could trust him yet, but one thing was certain, he had given her hope. And now, she had to face the truth. The experiment that went wrong. Eric sat across from her, adjusting his scanner. He had found a way to track her heat signature, but it wasn't perfect. "All right," he said, glancing at the flickering screen. "Let's figure out what really happened here." Zira hesitated. She had spent years avoiding the answer. But if she ever wanted to escape this limbo, she had to remember. Taking a shaky breath, she reached for the console's emergency logs. Her fingers, still distorted by her cloaking field, pressed the activation key. The screen flickered to life, and the past came rushing back. The final log. A holographic recording appeared, a blurry image of a scientist in a Silarus lab coat. Zira's breath hitched. Dr. Veyran, the head scientist of the project, the man who had led the research on their species' most advanced cloaking technology. He looked disheveled, his normally neat tendrils of hair twisted in stress. His voice was urgent, panicked. "Experiment failure. We miscalculated the distortion field. Energy output exceeded expectations. We lost one of our own." Zira's heart stopped. "Zira, she's gone. The cloaking field collapsed. We couldn't recover her signal. We think she's lost between dimensions." Eric narrowed his eyes. "They thought you phased out of reality." Zira swallowed hard. The scientist continued, his voice full of guilt. "We searched every system. Every scan showed nothing. No life signs, no heat signatures, no neural activity. It was as if she had never existed. I failed her. We have no choice but to abandon the station. The research is too dangerous. The field is unstable. We can't risk anyone else. May the stars forgive us." The log ended. Silence filled the room. The horror of realization. Zira couldn't move. For years, she had believed she had died. That she had become a ghost. That she was a forgotten fragment of reality. But the truth was worse. She had been alive the entire time. Her people had searched for her, but their technology had failed. She had screamed. She had tried to make them see. But to their sensors, to their instruments, she hadn't existed. And so they had left her behind. Eric exhaled slowly. Damn. Zira felt like she was falling. She had spent years trying to understand why no one could see her, why she had been trapped in this endless void of isolation. Now she knew. And it hurt. The human's perspective. Eric rubbed his jaw. This was bad. Zira wasn't a ghost. She wasn't a spirit trapped between worlds. She was a victim of failed technology, a glitch in a system that wasn't meant to fail. But to Eric, there was something even more unsettling. Her people had abandoned the station because they feared the cloaking field. They left because they thought she was gone. But what if they were wrong about everything? Eric's mind was racing. Zira's condition wasn't permanent. It couldn't be. If she had survived the accident, then there had to be a way to bring her back. You're not lost, Eric said firmly. Zira flinched. He looked straight at the space where he knew she was standing. Your people made a mistake. They didn't see you. But I do. Zira trembled. For years, she had convinced herself there was no way out, but this human was refusing to accept that. And for the first time, she wondered, could he be right? A dangerous plan. Eric leaned forward, tapping on his scanner. If your cloaking field is biological, then that means your body is still producing the effect. Which means, Zira understood before he even finished the sentence. The field can be turned off. Eric grinned. Exactly. Zira's mind raced. It made sense. The field had been created inside her. It was a defense mechanism, a survival trait of her species. If it could be activated, then it could be reversed. But there was a problem. The original cloaking field collapsed in an explosion. What if reversing it was just as dangerous? Eric noticed the hesitation in her movements. Hey, he said. I know it's risky. Zira felt her fingers clench into fists. She had spent years in fear, years believing there was no escape. Now, there was a chance. One last chance. Was she willing to take it? Eric smirked. I have a feeling you're not the type to give up. Zira let out a slow breath. No, she wasn't. She had survived this long. She wouldn't stop now. The human plan. A decision in the dark. Zira stood motionless, her body still hidden by the unnatural cloak that had imprisoned her for years. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she had an answer. She was not a ghost. She was not lost between dimensions. She was alive. And now, the human, Eric Monroe, was telling her that she could be saved. The very idea terrified her. Hope was a dangerous thing. Hope could be crushed. But at the same time, she had spent so long believing there was no escape. Could she risk not trying? Eric was already moving, pulling apart his gear, modifying his scanner with quick, precise movements. His mind was sharp, his hands steady. He was a soldier, a survivor, a problem solver. He had faced worse odds than this before. But Zira had doubts. Her voice, weak and uncertain, cut through the silence. What if it doesn't work? Eric barely glanced up. Then we try something else. She swallowed hard. What if I die? He finally looked at her, or at least where he knew she was. A small, confident smile tugged at the corner of his lips. I don't let people die. His words carried certainty, a strength Zira had long since lost. For the first time in years, she felt something she thought had died inside her. Trust. The human's solution. Eric flipped open his wrist communicator, scrolling through old schematics. All right, he muttered to himself. If your body is generating this cloaking field, then that means it has an energy source. He glanced at the scanner readings. Bioelectrical energy fluctuations. That meant her body was still emitting signals, just ones that were scrambled and distorted. If he could disrupt those signals, he might be able to force the field to collapse. But how? His mind ran through possible solutions. His training in military tech and survival mechanics had taught him that energy disruptions could be reversed. Stealth fields. EMP pulses usually worked. Biological cloaking. That was trickier. Then it hit him. Neural synchronization. He had seen tech like this before. Alien species that used bioelectrical pulses to sync their nervous systems with stealth gear. If Zyra's body was trapped in a constant energy loop, then the only way to break it would be to reset the loop. A hard reboot. "We need to override your biosignals," he said finally. "Think of it like a broken circuit. The field is stuck in an on state. We have to force it to switch off." Zyra hesitated. "How?" Eric tapped his device. "We send a controlled electromagnetic pulse through your nervous system, just enough to reset the cloaking effect." She tensed. "That sounds incredibly dangerous." Eric grinned. "Only if we get it wrong." She didn't find that comforting. The risk. Zyra's hands trembled. She had spent years trapped in this prison of light and shadow. The idea that she could finally be free felt impossible. But what if it failed? What if the pulse overloaded her body? What if her nervous system couldn't handle the reset? Eric seemed to sense her hesitation. "You don't have to do this," he said, voice softer now. "But you have to ask yourself, are you really willing to stay like this forever?" Zyra's breath caught in her throat. No, she wasn't. She had been alone too long. She had faded from existence. Now, someone saw her. Someone cared. Someone was willing to fight for her. How could she not fight for herself? She lifted her chin. "What do I need to do?" Eric's eyes gleamed. "Now we're talking." The setup. They moved to the station's power core. Zyra remembered this place. It had once been the beating heart of their research. Now it was just a dark, hollow shell of abandoned potential. Eric crouched near an exposed control panel, reconnecting old circuits. Sparks danced from the wires as he hacked into the energy grid. "You'll need to stand in the exact center," he said. "Once I trigger the pulse, your body should react to the surge and, hopefully, reset the cloaking effect." Zyra inhaled sharply. "And if it doesn't?" Eric smirked. "Then I owe you a drink in the afterlife." She rolled her eyes. Humans. The moment of truth. Zyra stepped onto the metal platform. The station's power hummed beneath her feet. Eric adjusted his scanner, fingers moving with military precision. "All right," he said. "On my count. 3, 2. He hit the button. A shockwave of energy erupted through the platform. Zyra screamed. Her body convulsed as electricity surged through her nervous system. She felt everything. The weight of her limbs, the pulse of her heart, the tingling sensation of heat rushing to her skin. And then, a blinding flash. She collapsed. Silence. The return. Eric's breath caught in his throat. "Zyra." No response. "Zyra." He rushed forward, grabbing his scanner. Her biosigns were faint. Too faint. His heart pounded. No, 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 no. Not like this. He dropped to his knees, reaching out, then froze. His hands touched something solid. Not air, not an invisible force. Skin. Eric's breath caught. Zyra's body was flickering, her outline becoming visible in flashes of dim light. Then, with a sudden final pulse of energy, she was there, lying on the floor, real, whole, visible. Eric exhaled, his grin returning. "Well, Dan." Zyra's eyes fluttered open. Her fingers curled against the cold metal. She felt it. She looked at her hands, her real, visible hands. Tears welled in her eyes. I'm back." Eric chuckled. "Told you I don't let people die." She laughed. A real sound, no longer lost in silence. For the first time in years, Zyra was truly alive. But as the two of them stood there, celebrating her return, neither of them noticed the station's emergency lights flicker on. A signal pulsed through the station's long-dead systems. Somewhere, deep in space, something received the signal. And it was coming. The experiment. The first breath of freedom. Zira gasped as her lungs filled with air, real, deep, undeniable air. The sharp coldness of the metal beneath her skin sent shivers through her body. For years, she had been trapped, unseen, unheard, forgotten. But now, she was real again. She lifted a trembling hand before her face, watching as her fingers curled into a fist. Her hand, her skin. Tears blurred her vision. She was back. Eric Monroe knelt beside her, scanning her body with careful precision. His wrist device beeped rapidly, showing stable but weak vitals. "You're alive," he said with a slow grin, relief washing over his face. Zira let out a shaky laugh. "I think I might need a moment." Eric chuckled. "Take your time. Not every day you come back from the dead." Zira took a deep breath, savoring the feeling of being whole again. But deep inside her, something felt off. Like a ripple in the air. A hum beneath the surface. And then, the station's emergency alarms blared. A warning too late. Eric's instincts kicked in immediately. He grabbed his blaster, eyes scanning the dark corridors. Zira's breath hitched as she struggled to sit up. What's happening? Eric checked his wrist scanner. Incoming transmission. That made no sense. The station had been dead for years. Who was contacting them? A voice crackled through the static. Unregistered life signs detected. Identifying. Alert. Foreign presence co-environed. Eric swore under his breath. Not good. Zira clutched her head, trying to process. What? Foreign presence. Eric's jaw tightened. Us. Zira's stomach dropped. Before she could react, the station's power surged back to life. Lights flickered on. Consoles whirred. Long dormant systems rebooted, waking from their slumber. The station wasn't just detecting them. It was reactivating. And somewhere deep in the void of space, something had heard the call. The shadow signal. Zira forced herself onto her feet, still shaky but growing stronger by the second. We need to shut it down. Eric nodded. Way ahead of you. They sprinted through the corridors, dodging flickering sparks and malfunctioning doors. The station's AI system was awake, its ancient programming kicking in. The voice returned, now clearer and colder. Unauthorized personnel detected. Preparing security protocols. Zira's heart pounded. Security protocols. Eric glanced over his shoulder. Yeah, that's never a good thing. Suddenly, the walls hissed open, and out of the darkness stepped the station's last remaining defense. The Forgotten Guardians. Two humanoid figures emerged from the walls, moving with eerie precision. Zira inhaled sharply. She recognized them immediately. Automated Silarus defense drones. Hunter-class models. They had been left behind as the station's last line of defense. But now, they saw Zira as an intruder. Their mechanical voices droned in unison. Foreign entity detected. Initiating elimination sequence. Eric raised his blaster. Okay, I think negotiations are off the table. The drones moved fast. Zira barely had time to react before the first one lunged at her. She threw herself to the side as a plasma blade cut through the air where she had been standing. Eric fired a precise shot, striking one drone's leg. The machine staggered but didn't fall. Zira's mind raced. They weren't built to recognize her anymore. She had been marked as lost, dead, erased. To them, she was just another intruder. And intruders were eliminated. The power core gambit. Zira dodged another strike, barely staying ahead of the relentless machines. Eric, ducking behind a console, shouted over the chaos. We can't fight them forever. We need another plan. Zira's eyes flickered to the main power grid, still humming with energy from her reappearance. The core, she gasped. We overloaded. We short-circuit their systems. Eric glanced at the control panel. That'll shut down the whole station. Exactly. Eric grinned. I like the way you think. They both moved at once, Zira running toward the main energy relay, Eric laying down cover fire. Sparks rained down as the drones advanced. Zira's hands flew over the console, rewiring the main power conduit. Eric's blaster clicked empty. Zira, hurry up. One of the drones lunged. Zira slammed her fist against the emergency override. The station's lights exploded in a burst of white energy. The drones seized, their limbs locking up as the surge fried their circuits. And then, silence. The final mystery. Zira collapsed against the console, chest heaving. Eric kicked one of the disabled drones, exhaling hard. You know, I was really hoping today would be a little less dramatic. Zira let out a breathless laugh. Welcome to my life. Eric smirked, but then his expression grew serious. He pointed to a console still glowing faintly. One last transmission had been sent. Zira's stomach tightened as she stepped closer. The message was brief, a single line of text. Subject Zira. Status changed. Target reacquired. Eric read it and frowned. That doesn't sound good. Zira's pulse pounded in her ears. If someone had been monitoring the station, they knew she was alive now. She had been invisible for years. Now, the entire universe knew she had returned. Eric met her gaze, his expression serious. Whoever got that message, they're coming for you. Zira swallowed hard. She had survived the void. She had fought her way back from nothingness. But now, her real fight was only beginning. The return. A universe that sees her again. Zira stood at the edge of the command center, staring at the glowing message on the screen. Subject Zira. Status change. Target reacquired. For years, she had been a ghost, a forgotten shadow in an abandoned station. Now she was back. And somewhere out there, someone knew it, her hands clenched into fists. Who had sent this message? More importantly, who was coming for her? Eric Monroe stood beside her, arms crossed. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by something dead serious. I don't know who's on the other end of that transmission, he said, but I bet my last rations that they're not coming to throw you a welcome-back party. Zira let out a shaky breath. Then we don't wait for them to come to us. Eric arched an eyebrow. You thinking what I think you're thinking. Zira turned to him. We take the fight to them. Chasing the signal. The station was still powered up, its ancient systems humming with renewed life after years of dormancy. Eric tapped at the console, searching for the source of the outgoing message. This was an automated distress beacon, he muttered, but someone hardwired it into the station's mainframe. Zira frowned. So it wasn't an accident. Someone wanted to track me. Eric nodded grimly. And they've been waiting for the moment you became visible again. A cold shiver ran down Zira's spine. Can you trace the receiver? She asked. Eric's fingers danced over the keys. Give me a second. There. The screen flashed. A location, a ship, a name. Zira's breath hitched. The Revenant. She staggered back, pulse racing. Eric immediately caught the shift in her posture. You know it. Zira's voice was barely above a whisper. They're Silarus Black Ops. Eric stiffened. Your own people? She nodded. Not just any division. The Revenant was tasked with eliminating unstable experiments. Eric's expression darkened. Let me guess. They don't leave loose ends. Zira swallowed hard. If they think I'm a threat, they'll kill me. Eric let out a sharp breath. Great. More murder squads. She turned back to the console. We need to move before they get here. Eric glanced at her. You got a plan. Zira's fingers flew across the controls. A ship's systems were waking up. Not the Revenant. Their own escape. She looked at Eric, determination burning in her eyes. We steal a ship, and then we find out why they were watching me. Eric grinned. Now that's a plan I can get behind. The escape begins. They ran through the corridors, past broken machinery and old debris. The docking bay was ahead. Zira's mind raced. This wasn't just about survival anymore. Something bigger was at play. Her people had erased her, marked her as dead, forgotten her. But the Revenant had been watching. That meant someone knew the truth, and she was going to find out why. As they reached the bay, Eric skidded to a stop. "Oh, we've got a problem." Zira's stomach dropped. The ship, their only way off this station, was locked down. Eric cursed. "It's on remote control. The Revenant's already in range." Zira clenched her teeth. "Then we take it back." Eric gave her a side glance. "I like how you think." They bolted to the control room, where Zira hacked into the ship's security override. The moment she cracked the system, a warning blared across the station. "Unauthorized access detected. Remote force incoming." Eric swore. "They're already here." Zira's heart pounded. They had minutes. And then the Revenant would arrive. The final countdown. Zira's fingers flew over the controls. "I can disable the remote link, but I need a few more minutes." Eric unholstered his weapon. "I'll hold them off." Zira's head snapped toward him. "You can't take on a Black Ops squad alone." Eric gave her a cocky grin. "You underestimate how annoying I can be." Zira swallowed back a retort. He was buying her time, and she needed that time. Eric moved to the entrance, his blaster raised. Boots echoed down the corridors. The Revenant had arrived. The battle for freedom. The doors slid open, and the first operative stepped inside. They were fast, precise, shadows in motion. Eric fired. A clean shot, center mass. The operative vanished midair. Eric barely had time to react before a blade sliced toward his throat. He ducked, rolling to the side. "Damn it, they have stealth tech." Zira turned sharply. "I can disrupt it. Hold them off." Eric fired blindly, using his instincts to track movement. Zira worked at lightning speed, rewiring the ship's controls. 90% override complete. She glanced up, just in time to see a Revenant soldier closing in on Eric. Her heart stopped. Then, Zira moved. Faster than she thought possible, she grabbed a fallen weapon and fired a pulse blast. The operative was thrown back, their cloaking field failing. Eric grinned. "Nice shot." Zira didn't hesitate. "Get on the ship." Eric sprinted toward the open hatch. Zira slammed her hand onto the console. 100% override complete. She bolted inside, hitting the launch sequence. The Revenant operatives rushed toward the ship. But it was too late. The engines roared to life. The docking bay doors exploded outward. And then, they were free. What comes next? Zira slumped back in the pilot's chair, breathless. Eric leaned against the wall, smirking. "Well, that was fun." Zira shook her head. "You and I have very different definitions of fun." Eric laughed. "Yeah, probably." Then, his expression turned serious. "So, where to?" Zira exhaled slowly. She looked at the distant stars. Somewhere out there, someone had tried to erase her. Someone had tried to silence her. Now, she was going to find them, and she was going to make them answer for it. She turned to Eric. "We find the truth." Eric grinned. "Now we're talking." The ship accelerated into the void. And Zira, for the first time in years, was in control of her own fate.